Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you today. I have to confess that I come to this panel from a tangent, or rather from two tangents. Firstly, I'm tangential to this panel because I don't work in a museum and I don't run one. I teach art history in a university, so my position is of a museum observer rather than a museum maker. Secondly, I'm based in New Delhi in India. And despite the long history of India and all the art that it's produced over the centuries, my country is not noted for its great museums or for its strongly rooted museum cultures. Museums are simply not a feature of our everyday cultural life the way they are in Paris or Berlin or New York. So the first point that I want to make is that even though we don't have a vibrant culture of museum going, there is actually a remarkable feature of the history of museums in India that deserves to be better known. We're often told that museums were imposed upon India by colonialism and that the institution never really took root here. But the fact is that in the colonial period, these colonial museums were hugely popular. And in the early 20th century, the visitorship of some of the major museums in India was larger than the visitorship of the British Museum in the same year. One museum, the Madras Museum, actually counted 70,000 visitors on the same day. Now, this was a day of a traditional festival that is meant to celebrate the faculty of sight. And it's a custom on that day for families to go out and see something together. So when the museum arrived, it offered something special to see. And we see how, in this instance, the colonial institution of the museum intersected with the old tradition of a festival to produce a viewing situation that I assume is quite different from the viewing situations encountered by museums anywhere else in the world. Now, museum keepers tell us that a majority of this huge number of visitors that came were poor, illiterate people who were not actually interested in what the museum was trying to tell them. Instead, they were using the museum on their own terms. And even today, the museums in India that are free to visit or that are very cheap to visit are filled with very large working class crowds. And historically, it's understood that their presence in the museum has kept the middle class out of the museum. This frustrates museum staff because they don't manage to reach their intended audiences. But I think that this phenomenon actually has a very profound meaning for the history of democracy. In India, society is very hierarchical, and even temples did not allow everybody to enter them. The lowest castes were considered untouchable, and they only gained the right to enter temples after India's independence in 1955, when certain new laws that didn't allow this kind of discrimination to be exercised were passed. So in India, the museum is actually the first civic space in which the poorest of the poor, the lowest of the low, could enter as a right. And I think, therefore, that it is here in the museum that the most incredibly marginalized people of India got their first taste of what it is to be a citizen with rights. It is here that they got their first intimation of what democracy can be. The reason that I'm bringing up these things from the past in a panel that's looking to the future is because I want to stress that we don't have the same past and therefore we don't have the same future. And despite all of our interconnections, despite the fact that we read the same books or we take an interest in the same phenomena, context matters. And even when it looks like we are building the same kind of institutions or we are having similar viewing experiences, what that institution means or what that viewing experience is contextually determined. And in different places, museums, democracy, and the future can be very different things. The second point that I want to make is about how we then move towards imagining a different kind of future. Today, although India is a backwater in the museum world, there are a lot of art collectors and museologists and bureaucrats and politicians who have been making noises about trying to catch up with the museum world elsewhere. And one of the ways in which this catch-up game has manifested in many places of the world is through the commissioning of very spectacular museum architecture. Ever since the success of the Guggenheim in Bilbao, other places have tried to replicate its formula, and for some time, China was the world epicenter of this phenomenon, with literally thousands of new museums being built within the space of a decade. Many of these new museums had very eye-catching buildings, and architects were given free rein in their design. Now we know that a lot of these projects actually tied in with real estate companies that wanted to build a brand for townships by including a signature building, but they did not have the know-how or the patience to invest in building collections, staffing the institution, or running programs that would make the museums come alive. So China now is saddled with hundreds of ghost museums, empty museum buildings that are going to have to find new uses. If this strategy of investing in collecting museum buildings has its pitfalls, then building a museum collection is also fraught with danger. Looking back on the fact that the great collections of the past were made under the aegis of colonialism, and looking today at how many attempts to build museum collections get entangled with the illegal art trade, we have to realize that this making museum collections is actually not a normal kind of activity. It is not an activity that gets done under free and fair conditions. Both historically and in the present, it seems to feed off conditions of radical inequality and radical unfairness. Now, international organizations tell us that the ethical thing to do today is to refuse to buy things that have a bad provenance, and that in time the market for them will get depressed and unprovenanced antiquities will be squeezed out. We've all seen how that's worked out during these past years. So I say, let us move away from the model where the museums are the end point of the market, and let's move towards a model where the museum is the starting point of a lending library. Let's start sharing and circulating museum collections that already exist. We know that there are so many collections that have vast amounts of material that are lying in storage unseen. Let's tap these. Let's build a true community of cooperation. It would be such a better way to fulfill the needs of empty museums that are desirous of collections. And I think that this model of sharing will also have implications for the many repatriation demands that are multiplying nowadays. A lot of repatriation demands are made in the spirit of restitution to undo past sufferings. But past sufferings cannot be undone, and a joint future can be built. A redistributive justice is so much better than a retributive one. Let's try to share. Finally, the third point I want to make, and this is very much from my perspective in India, but perhaps it'll have resonance elsewhere. Although we are not a country with a great public interest in museums, there is a great deal of public interest in matters that are very close to museums. History, for example, is something that is very broadly discussed in India and very hotly debated over there. And the role of artworks and archaeological finds as evidence of history are very closely scrutinized and sometimes becomes front page news. But our museums play no role as authoritative adjudicators in these debates, or even as lively platforms where these discussions can take place. Partly this is because our museums are state-owned. They are strangled by their own bureaucracy. Or because they are organs of state, they have to toe an official line and they cannot afford any controversies. Ideally, a museum should have the same autonomy that a university has, but I don't think this is going to be possible. And in the absence of that kind of freedom within the museum, my hope is that vitality and energy will come to our museums from outside, from other sources. If a museum's education department is not doing much, nothing stops others from using museum collections for education, to offer alternative guided tours, to use museum displays as a launching point for interdisciplinary discussions. What would it be to be guided through a gallery full of Hindu sculptures of gods and goddesses in India's National Museum by a Dalit, a member of what were formerly called the lowest, the untouchable castes? What would it be like to be guided through the British Museum by an Iraqi refugee? And not as guides that are trained to recite a predetermined script written by the museum authorities, but to hear what these people might have to say about these objects from their own perspectives. These are some of the things I'd like to see someday in the future of museums. But I'm interested in knowing what you have to say about these ideas. And so let's discuss it when we get into my deep dive. Thank you.